Hey guys, welcome back to CLOWNFISH TV. This is Neon, and we're going to talk about the Kickstarter Union. Yeah, this is kind of a big deal. We didn't really talk about it before. We've kind of only somewhat followed Kickstarter off and on the last year or two. You know, usually decisions on their part to ban certain creators or play moral police, moral authority on certain projects, and there's a reason that that's happening. And I want to talk to you about the union and how the Kickstarter Union happened, why it happened. It happened not because Kickstarter wanted better working conditions, as most unions advocate for, but because Kickstarter employees wanted more say when it comes to activism. That is literally the reason that they started this union. And this could be a problem for a lot of creators as Kickstarter transitions from a payment processor to what they call a public benefit corporation, almost like a patron of the arts. You need to hit certain criteria. You have to be the right kind of person. It has to be the right kind of project. Basically, you have to deserve Kickstarter. And I think now that they have decided to unionize at Kickstarter, things are going to potentially get worse. Things are going to become more and more strict for creators and projects, and you're really going to have to think about whether or not you want to go through the purity test it's going to take to get a project on Kickstarter. So before we get started, please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants. We're at almost 100,000 subs, guys. We're like 3,000 away, and we do appreciate the support. All right, so before we get into this, I want to talk about how important crowdfunding has become to the failing comic book industry. The comic book industry is dying. It really is dying, and you know, the direct market is dying. Now, I want to reiterate, I'm not talking about graphic novels. I'm not talking about the book market necessarily. I'm not talking about manga, which is actually seeing an uptick in sales. I'm talking about the direct market and a lot of indie publishers. We're seeing IDW is having a hard time surviving now. They're banking on Hollywood. We've seen a lot of smaller press companies merge to survive. I mean, we've got Oni Press and Lion Forge. They had to combine to survive. We have a lot of these publishers. I scratch my head and wonder how they even stay in business, because they're only selling, you know, less than 1,000 copies a month of some of their books. And I'm like, how are you even surviving? How are you surviving? And the truth is, a lot of them are surviving because of, you know, Kickstarter and IndieGoGo, more so Kickstarter. Kickstarter is becoming more and more important to the comic book industry because the jobs are drying up. The economy's drying up. So more and more people are turning to Kickstarter. It used to be, there was a joke, and we talked about this before, and it's so funny to see how things have changed. When Kickstarter first came on the scene back in like 2008, 2009, whenever it started, I think it was like 2009, and people started using it to crowdfund comics, a lot of the publishers threw shade at people using crowdfunding because they said it was panhandling, it was e-begging. Only desperate people would use something like Kickstarter or IndieGoGo to fund a book. It means that they don't have their shit together, they don't have their money saved, they're not willing to spend their own money. And then like a few years later, we saw Fantagraphics have to use Kickstarter just to stay in business. You know, it's kind of funny, but we also saw some weird stuff with Kickstarter and publishers where, you know, because of that mindset that Kickstarter has basically become a charity, which, you know, they've kind of doubled down on that, and I want to talk about that. Because of that, some publishers are actually shamed from using it. I know Archie Comics tried to do a Kickstarter a couple of years ago, and they were basically shamed out of doing that Kickstarter because the comic book industry, or the readers, Twitter, basically felt that they didn't deserve it. They didn't deserve the charity of Kickstarter. They did not pass the purity test to be able to use Kickstarter. And that was just, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. Now Kickstarter is in the middle of another discussion about what kinds of content they're going to allow on their platform. And this union is not necessarily a good thing for creators because it's just one more hoop you're going to have to jump through. And again, I can't understate how important Kickstarter and IGG are to IndieGoGo. Are to comics right now, because if it wasn't for crowdfunding, comics probably would have died already, or at least there would be significantly fewer indie comics, because everybody seems to be using it now to bankroll their comic books. So that is what's really sad. That's how ground down the comic book industry has become, that you have to resort to crowdfunding just to be able to get your stuff out there. Not that it isn't a good system. I mean, it's a good system to gauge interest and take pre-orders, but it's gone beyond that. Kickstarter is not about taking pre-orders anymore. It never really was. I mean, there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what Kickstarter was originally. It was basically you were funding a project, and if you got a physical reward, it was a perk. It wasn't actually like you were buying a product. And somewhere along the line, it became conflated. Now it's like it became a pre-order system, and now, you know, they're trying to say that they're basically a public benefit company, and they're not a store like Amazon. Anyway. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about this article I came across because here in the Pittsburgh area, we know that there are a lot of tech companies and that Google actually has an office in Pittsburgh. Okay, that's kind of cool, right? So I came across this article in Marketplace talking about why Kickstarter organized. Now they talk about Google, the contractors unionized so that they get the same benefits that the full-time Google employees get. But they talk about Kickstarter and why Kickstarter actually unionized. And it wasn't to advocate for better working conditions like the people at Google. It's because they had a political agenda. Some of the people working there, they wanted to be able to be activists. So this is the person conducting the interview is talking to this Megan McCarty-Carino about what a big deal it is that Google contract workers in Pittsburgh can unionize now too. And the interviewer says, so you're saying some of the things, the fuzzier, I guess, are culture issues. They're part of this union, this contract. What do you think that means for the rest of the tech industry? And they talk about the you know, how Kickstarter is a public benefit corporation. I'm going to talk about that. Could be a case of where it looks like having a formal union and having a formal process to bring issues to the table with the employer is really useful, especially as we're seeing cases at Google and cases at Amazon, employees being dismissed who have been linked to worker activism. Employees being dismissed for having been linked to worker activism. Now, that could mean that employees have been dismissed for, you know, trying to unionize, as Kickstarter did. Or it could mean something else. So basically, if you're an activist and you know, your views are controversial, the company has the right to get rid of you. If your Twitter is controversial, the company has the right to get rid of you. Now let's backpedal a little bit. Kickstarter reincorporated. They reincorporated in 2015. There's a difference between Kickstarter campaigns before 2015 and those currently. Kickstarter Inc. is no more. We're now Kickstarter PBC. A public benefit corporation. We're thrilled to share the news, and we'd love to take a minute to tell you what this means. And this is important because this is the road that Kickstarter is going down. Kickstarter is basically setting itself up to be more of a charity, charity for select people who are going to bring good to the world according to the people who work at Kickstarter, and less of a payment processor, right? Kickstarter hasn't been a payment processor since before September 21st, 2015. So until recently, the idea of a for-profit company pursuing social good at the expense of shareholder value had no clear protection under U.S. corporate law and certainly no mandate. Benefit corporations are different. Benefit corporations are for-profit companies that are obligated to consider the impact of their decisions on society, not only to shareholders. Radically, positive impact on society became part of the benefit corporation's legally defined goals. So like Patagonia and This American Life, we've become a benefit corporation. Only less than 1%, 0.01% of all American businesses have done this. Okay, so this is the thing. So Kickstarter since 2015 has basically been telling people, they've been telling people through actually restructuring the company that they're putting social causes and activism before profit. Okay, this is important because this is what happened with the union situation. Okay, Kickstarter, what kicked this off, and people seem to forget what kicked this off. It was a comic book. It was a comic book of all things, because Kickstarter, like the comics campaigns, don't do gangbusters compared to tech or compared to you know, video games or compared to other things. It was about a comic book called Always Punch Yahtzees. We talked about that before. The drive to organize Kickstarter, while concerned with traditional issues like pay and workplace diversity, sprung out of an internal dispute about a fundraiser for the book Always Punch Yahtzees, according to Slate. We did cover that before. A debate over the politics of the book spilled into a debate over punching Yahtzees. Workers decided they should have more say, and here we go, this is very important. Workers decided they should have more say in the kind of projects the company gives a platform to. Once you set your values, those things keep getting tested, Strickler told me. That seems like what's been happening this year. So when Kickstarter decided it was going to be a public benefit corporation and not Kickstarter Inc., they basically said, we're going to put social causes above profit, and the workers all have their own ideas about what that means. Everybody's going to feel differently about different projects. So this explains a lot. So when you go to their charter and you go to their letter where they're talking about why they unionized, you look at this and it's not necessarily about working conditions. It's about these workers having the right to veto projects, or if they have a concern about a project, being able to terminate a project or let the project go. Now, in the case with Always Punch Yahtzees, the workers at Kickstarter were pro Always Punch Yahtzees. They wanted that book to be funded. Kickstarter's top brass said, no, this is too controversial. We're not going to advocate for a book that punches or advocates for punching people. And mostly it was about punching, as I understand it. I don't have a copy of it. Very few people actually bought it. But as I understand it, it was about punching anyone who was right-wing. It didn't go well. It hit the media outlet and hit the media outlets, and Kickstarter pulled the plug on it, and the employees had a cow because of it. So here's the thing. This is what their union hard codes are. They're not really all related to working conditions. Some of it talks about pay, compensation, diversity and inclusion and hiring, professional growth and product, disciplinary transparency. I mean, these are pretty normal things, right? But here we have the preservation of a company culture that fosters a sense of community in the workplace, the proactive inclusion of employees in company-wide decisions that affect us all. So what is going on here? Basically, the employees want the right, I believe, to veto certain projects, and it got started because of comics. It got started because of comics. Now, why is this important? Well, let's go back to this. Kickstarter has become a gateway to publishing comic books at this point. Like, if you can't get published anywhere else, Kickstarter was being used as a means to fund your comic book. The problem is Kickstarter used to not have gatekeepers. It was pretty much anybody who had a project that even hit the bare minimum requirements could solicit that project on Kickstarter and get their stuff published. The problem is now we have people from the mainstream comic book industry basically being brought in, installed at Kickstarter to guide the direction of the projects that Kickstarter will fund. Now, again, this is a case of, like, people would go to Kickstarter to publish comics because they were trying to publish outside the mainstream. Now we have someone from the mainstream, okay, from DC Comics, coming in and basically acting as a de facto gatekeeper at Kickstarter. This, coupled with the fact that the union said they unionized because they wanted the right to be able to, you know, veto projects they didn't agree with or whatever, it doesn't look good really for creators who are maybe producing stuff that wouldn't gel with what Kickstarter is doing. And the problem is I don't know if Kickstarter is really telling people, you know, what kinds of projects are go or no go. But Camilla Zong joined Kickstarter. She was from DC Comics. And again, I'm not throwing shade at Camilla Zong. I'm just saying there is somebody at Kickstarter who has a clear political bias, who is going to oversee the comics projects. You know, I mean, that is the truth. That is the truth. And they're allowed to do that. And they're especially allowed to do that now because they've got the union that says they're allowed to. So when does this become an issue? Well, if you're just doing something very middle of the road, or you're a non-offensive creator or whatever, I don't think it's going to affect you that much. However, they have said that there are certain marginalized groups that they're going to promote over other Kickstarter projects. So let me back this up a little bit and talk about the situation with Your boy Zach, YouTuber, formerly known as Diversity in Comics, not known as Diversity in Comics now. There's another guy using Diversity in Comics. He's your boy Zach, Comics Matter. Did a comic called Jawbreakers. You probably heard of it. It was kind of a big deal because Kickstarter would not allow him to use the platform to fundraise basically his G.I. Joe book. It was a PG-13 G.I. Joe type book. The reason they did not give a specific reason, okay, you know, he said, I don't understand. The project does meet your rules. It's a simple story about superheroes rescuing a monster that people want to exploit. They're diverse racially and sexually. Both I and the artist are veterans. My family is diverse. I have a Muslim daughter, yada, yada. Richard, thanks for sharing your project with us. We've carefully reviewed it against our rules. We're unable to approve it to launch. As a public benefit corporation, this is important, public benefit corporation committed to fighting inequality. Remember that public benefit corporation thing I talked about? Yeah, it basically gives Kickstarter leeway to boot anyone for any reason at this point. Kickstarter does not allow projects that promote discrimination, subjugation, or intolerance towards marginalized groups. Read the rules, but they didn't cite a specific violation. The problem is that people had issues with Richard Meyer's YouTube channel, even though it was not connected really to the comic book itself. The comic book itself wasn't bad, but Kickstarter, as a public benefit corporation, you know, this is their mission statement now, public benefit corporation, basically their guiding principles don't allow them to give guys like Richard C. Meyer money. They're not saying that specifically, because they probably could open themselves up to a lawsuit. So now at this point, you have to ask yourself, like, okay, so people use Kickstarter to get out of the mainstream to be able to fund books that normally would not get funded, and then Kickstarter pulls this thing in 2015 and makes sure that they can have, you know, say over what gets published and what doesn't get published based on really nebulous rules. And then we've got somebody from DC Comics being installed as a gatekeeper at Kickstarter. It's because the money's there. You know, this is what the deal is. The money is there. So of course the mainstream, which is dying, has to install one of its own, you know, to take charge of it. In my opinion, that's what it looks like, you know, from the outside. I don't know. And again, you don't have to agree with Richard Meyer. You don't have to agree with his videos, right? You don't have to. But it just shows that Kickstarter is being very selective about what they publish now, and I think it's going to get worse because of the union. There was an issue with another comic book published by somebody else who has controversial opinions, and even though they allowed the comic, apparently they buried it. Like, you could not find the comic on the platform. If you had a direct link to it, they would take your money. They would take your money, but they weren't going to help promote your product. And this has also happened with a couple of other comic book artists that the powers that be at Kickstarter have decided were problematic. Now, there may or may not be a connection to the mainstream comic book industry. You know, I think there is. I think the fact that they've got, you know, someone installed at Kickstarter who's worked with a lot of these people, you know, really, it would just take a phone call to call up Kickstarter and be like, hey, this is the wrong kind of person. Don't let them fundraise anymore. And that's all it's going to take. You know, here's a problematic video. Here's a problematic tweet. Don't let them. As a public benefit corporation, you can't in good conscience let these people make money on Kickstarter because they're awful people. So, you know, there's a lot of things going on there. Now, meanwhile, IndieGoGo, which used to be the definitely the D-list choice for a lot of people, because of Kickstarter tightening its criteria, tightening its reign on the kinds of people that are allowed to use the platform, IndieGoGo has blown up. And we've seen more six-figure comic book campaigns on IndieGoGo than we've seen in Kickstarter in a long, long time. Kickstarter might be making more money on more campaigns now, but you don't see those massive six-figure campaigns as often as you used to, because a lot of people are using Kickstarter, and it has become more of like a charity type thing. And it's, you know, everybody's using it now, but it's so sad when you see like IDW Publishing put out a Kickstarter and only gets like $25,000 or $30,000, and that's with like a bunch of people working on an anthology. You know, then you go out to IndieGoGo and you've got people who have never made a comic book before, you know, but they went to IndieGoGo and they're making like $100,000. You know, it's pretty sad. I mean, we had, you know, obviously Cyberfrog, Ethan Van Sciver, former DC Comics artist, made bank on multiple versions of Cyberfrog. We had Doug TenNapel. Doug TenNapel what made like $100,000 in a day on Earthworm Jim. I mean, it's insane. So, you know, a lot of creators who are feeling disenfranchised by Kickstarter are going to IndieGoGo. Thus far, IndieGoGo has been, you know, basically old school Kickstarter, where it's simply a payment processor, right? A pre-order taker. It doesn't have the purity test attached to it, I guess, that Kickstarter does. Now, obviously, you know, if there's some really problematic stuff, I can understand anybody saying like, yeah, we don't want to be responsible for this. You know, you've got a cookbook about how to eat children or something. That's not something we want to do. I get that. I totally get that. They're well within their rights to do that. But we're talking about comic book projects that are very middle of the road. Again, Jawbreakers, you know, think what you will about Meyer's YouTube channel, right? This really isn't that connected to it. And the story itself is no worse than anything you'd find at, you know, in any 90s comic book publisher, really. You know, so Kickstarter, and it's going to get worse. They're going to dictate the content, the kinds of projects that get funded. Now, I don't know what the future holds, though, because when you've got, you know, so many cooks in the kitchen and they all have opinions of what is in the public interest, you know, everybody could be offended by something else. You know, so this could actually complicate things. I don't know. I will say, though, that unions usually lead to layoffs. I don't know if that's going to be the case at Kickstarter, but I know that, you know, you look at Gizmodo and they made a big deal about unionizing, how great this was for the company and everything else. And it was followed by a bunch of layoffs because the company didn't want to deal with it. I got the vibe that Kickstarter, the people in charge at Kickstarter, did not want this union. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, it might be a case of they decide that, you know, it's not worth the hassle, that they're turning down a bunch of projects they otherwise could have made money on. And even though they're a public benefit corporation, they still have to make some money. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? But I am going to tell you, if you're looking to crowdfund a project, you're probably, if you're going to use Kickstarter, you're going to have to jump through a lot more hoops. You're going to have to keep your nose clean. You're going to have to make sure you're the right kind of person. You know, make sure you don't tweet anything that might offend some people that might be working at Kickstarter. Remember that there are people working at Kickstarter that could almost absolutely be proven to have some kind of connection to mainstream comic book people who don't like some people on YouTube. I mean, the rabbit hole goes pretty deep here. So just keep that in mind, or you could just go to, you know, someplace like IndieGoGo, or just take payments through PayPal or something like that. Might be a better option. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if this has any impact on the bottom line for comics, crowdfunding, who knows. I'm going to wrap this one up. Please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants, and we will talk later. Hey guys, thanks for watching Clownfish TV. Please consider supporting the channel. Go to clownfishsupport.com. That's clownfishsupport.com. And if you want to join our community, go to clownfishtalk.com. That's clownfishtalk.com. Please subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. We will talk to you next time.